Hello and welcome to Risk at Work, Riskonnect's educational web series. I'm Scott Fenstermaker. I'm the head of digital marketing. Today, we're going to be talking about strategies to help overcome the impact of cognitive bias in ERM. ERM relies on a great deal of human judgment, and that is likely always going to be the case. And though we do our best to see that we are always making judgments in the most objective way possible, we have blinders as human beings. And it may work out counterintuitively that the smarter the person trying to make these judgments, ironically, the more blinders that they might actually have in terms of whether or not they're introducing cognitive bias into the decision making. We're going to be talking about these kinds of phenomena today, where cognitive bias comes from in the decision making on ERM, and how best to make our decision making as objective as possible. First, a couple of housekeeping notes. As always, if you have a question for our guest, please put it into the question field of your webinar software. If we do not get a chance to answer that question during the course of the presentation, we will reach out to you individually with an answer from our speaker. Also, if you indicated that you would like CPE credit for attending this webinar, please watch your inbox after we're done here. We're going to send you a short 3-question quiz. You fill that out, send it back to us, and we will respond directly with your CPE credit. All right. We have the man back to talk about this with us today. Friend of the webinar, consultant, author, and lecturer on enterprise risk management, now providing consulting on ERM processes and technology outsourcing, as well as customer care. You know, his ERM program at Hydro One became the subject of a Harvard Business School case study. He is a regular lecturer at York University's Schulich School of Business in Toronto and has been a guest lecturer at Carleton University, Ryerson University, and Harvard Business School. He is the co-editor of the textbook, Enterprise Risk Management, Today's Leading Research and Best Practices for Tomorrow's Executives, available, he would want me to say, at fine online bookstores anywhere, or if you're me, on fine Kindle readers everywhere. I hope you can see that there. I'll show you my copy of it. I am pleased to have back to the webinar series, Rob Quail. Rob, how you doing?
Hi, Scott. That is the smallest Kindle reader I've ever seen. It looks
I
like a
know,
phone
right?
reader. Yeah.
My iPad is busy over here keeping time for us, so I had
Uh,
to show it on my phone. I don't actually read your book on that small a screen. I'll have you know, it would just take me forever.
yes.
All
All
right, my
right.
man, we're going to talk about cognitive biases today. So, please tell us what we're all doing wrong. Let's get started.
Well, I mean, one thing that's bothered me since the very beginning of my own ERM journey is the potential for ERM processes to fail to overcome, or even worse, actually reinforce dangerous cognitive biases, unchallenged beliefs, perpetuated myths. The worry, one thing that kept me up at night in those days was that I might be perpetuating sort of corporate mythology within, at the time, Hydro One about what was good and bad and what might hurt us and what might be good for us. ERM sits right on the boundary between the objective, the data about the past, and the subjective application of that to decisions about the future, and involves the participation and trust of the most important decision makers in the enterprise. We collect a bunch of data about the past and current performance, plus perhaps some contextual data such as overall trends in the business environment. We might have some kind of model or scale or other criteria through which we crunch all that data. Then we provide it to decision makers in the hopes that it will help them prepare to navigate through an unknowable future. All that data gathering analysis ultimately gets sorted and filtered by the decision maker's brain. And worse yet, all that complexity gets boiled down to some kind of brief, high-level, simplified report, which attempts to convey the risk picture to an executive team or a board so they can presumably make better decisions. So I expect you can understand what I mean when I say that risk management is fertile ground for these kinds of problems with cognitive bias to be perpetuated. Now, in my early ERM years, I had worried on a hit and miss basis about these and tried to tackle them one at a time. I'm embarrassed to admit that it was only when I was asked to put together a module on this as part of the Schulich Business School program about a decade ago that I really did much formal research and thinking about this in any structured way. But that research really strengthened some of my ideas. I guess that's a form of confirmation bias, but also led me lots of new ones about the best way to go about this ERM thing. So as of today, there are over 180 defined cognitive biases on Wikipedia, and today I'm going to go through every single one of them. Kidding, kidding, of course. I'm going to focus
We're
on
gonna
just
be here till
three.
next winter, dude.
That's right. We're going to go through just three categories. I'll talk about the bias types. I'll talk about the ways in which they can present a grave danger to your program and to your organization. And at the end, some strategies to overcome them. This is such an important topic, in my view, that in the book that you mentioned, Scott, there are two chapters on cognitive bias. One that lays out
Mhm.
different types of them, goes through some of the 180, and then another one about strategies in somewhat more detail than I can deal with in an hour. So the first category is the bias is all about stuff that happens inside the individual heads of your decision-making clients, how they approach problems and how they access and perceive information. So when I share this with you, and this is perhaps more impactful when you do it in a room full of people rather than online, when you see this problem, what does your mind go through when you see that problem? There's a little bit of a negative emotion, fear. Am I going to have to actually run through this calculation? You might be thinking, it's a fairly big number, not a huge one. If we were in a room together, you might be thinking, gee, I hope someone else answers this question before they call on me to answer it. And then if I share this, you say, could be, and you might feel a little bit relief that there's an answer, and so you don't have to expend all the effort trying to calculate it yourself. So what was going on in your head is what is often called system one. So system one, the ideas of there being a system one and system two, concept described in detail in Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. This is a book that, in my view, by the way, is required reading for anyone who wants to do ERM well. Um, our brains have evolved in this specific way with what Kahneman calls system one and system two. System one operates automatically with no control. It generates impressions, feelings, inclinations. When these are endorsed by system two, they become beliefs and attitudes. It infers causes and intention. It suppresses doubts. It's biased to believe and confirm what it sees. It focuses on existing readily available evidence and ignores the rest. Is that a wildebeest charging towards me? Yes, it is. Here's how I'm going to react to that. So systeminal allows you to do things like quickly react when being chased by a giant predator, but also allows you to do things like drive a car while listening to the radio. System two takes effort and focus. There's intent. You challenge assumptions. It's the true problem solving analytical part of the way your brain functions. So I need to tell you which system is better suited for tackling the kinds of problems we talk about in ERM. There are good reasons for the existence of system one, particularly historically or in an evolutionary context in terms of dealing with immediate danger. The problem is with people is that we overuse system one without us even being aware that this is happening. So I'm going to go through some implications of this overuse of system one in the next few slides. The first one is attribute substitution. This is answering an easier question. So when we ask a question that's difficult, system one might try to take over and reframe the question in your mind so you can answer it using much less effort. So suppose you're speaking to an executive about a risk and you ask the question, what are the greatest risks to the achievement of our strategic objectives? This is actually quite a difficult question to answer. In fact, it's the core question that all ERM processes are intended to answer, or part of it anyway. So you need to think about, well, what are our objectives? What are the major sources of uncertainty, both in the external and internal environment? What are the kinds of specific events or conditions through which those uncertainties might materialize, and how might they affect the organization? So it's not an easy question to answer. So what the decision maker will do when you ask them that question is substitute this one. What keeps me up at night? And that's easy. What was I worried about last night when I couldn't get to sleep? Here's another example. Are all our mitigating strategies comprehensive, effective, and appropriate? Again, complicated question. You need to catalog those different mitigating strategies. You need to compare them to some kind of ideal. You need to kind of prioritize the gaps and say, okay, here, yes, what we have in place is appropriate, effective, and comprehensive, or no, it's not. So what they will answer instead, how do I feel about how we're managing this? Easy. Here's a third example. Is this within our risk appetite? And do the benefits outweigh the overall risks? There's a lot of complex thinking and calculation, mental calculation involved in answering that question. So what does my gut say? Am I really worried about this? So my point is you don't really get an answer to the question you asked, nor is the analytical mind of the interviewed executive fully engaged. Just asking these bold questions without any kind of tools or processes or structure isn't going to get an answer to the actual question you asked. It's going to get an answer to the questions on the right. This is why we don't go with simple high, medium, low scales. or ever ask questions like what keeps you up at night when we're trying to get our handle on what key risks are. Another one is availability. This is the familiar has a disproportionate impact on the way we make decisions and process information and judge things. For example, there was a fairly recent large survey of Americans asking them about different perils and what are the most frequent killers. And tornadoes ranked much higher than asthma as a source of death in the US. Actually, asthma kills about 20 times many more Americans than tornadoes, but you're much more likely to be able to recall tornado deaths than asthma deaths because of your exposure to media. Here's another example. In the late 80s, there was a big scare about alar, which is a growth regulator that was sprayed on apples to keep them on the trees longer, not falling off before they get picked. When consumed in very, 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 very large doses, it increases the risk of cancer in rats or mice. And this whole discovery dominated the news. In fact, Meryl Streep, the acclaimed scientist Meryl Streep, testified before Congress. And as a result, there was a huge drop in apple consumption in the subsequent period in the US, and therefore a massive increase in health risk. Here's another example. In the months after 9/11, people avoided flying in huge numbers, which resulted in half again as many incremental traffic fatalities in the next months as had happened on the day of 9/11. Once again, accessible event, disproportionate impact on people just because it was available, it was all over the news for ages. Special mention is the last one in this slide, the illusory truth effect, and especially because this is 2024 and something like what 55% of the world's population is participating in elections, some form or another. This is also known as the truth effect or the illusion of truth effect. It's the tendency to believe information to be correct after repeated exposure. If something is familiar, such as seen in election campaign ads, you tend to believe it is more true. So how are all these threats to ERM? Specifically, the availability bias can show itself in dramatic ways. So in my own experience in the utility sector, in 1998, there was a massive ice storm that took down much of the electricity transmission and distribution system in Ontario and Quebec. And for the next 2 years later, we started our ERM program. And for the first 3 or 4 years of our ERM program, our executive and board insisted that ice storms be near the top of the key risks list. Even though everybody acknowledged that that ice storm was a once in a century event, it was available, it was easily recalled, and therefore it had a disproportionate impact on their thinking and their prioritization of risk and resulted in some overinvesting in highly unlikely events just because they could be easily recalled. Another one is a narrative fit. So picture this person, Steve, they're shy, they're very helpful, but they don't have much interest in people. They're meek and tidy, they have a need for order and structure. So the question is it more likely that this person, Steve, is a salesperson or a librarian? Most people will say librarian, right? Well, there are 13 million salespeople and only 166,000 librarians in the US. So now I ask you the question, is it more likely that Steve is a salesperson or a librarian? And clearly it's a salesperson. So we rely on this heuristic rather than analysis. If it seems to fit the story, we'll believe it. The problem in risk management is you want to explore combinations of things that might have no precedent. So there's no narrative that fits some of the risk scenarios you look at, but there's a tendency to make one or make it fit one. There's another example on the next slide. So December 13th, 2003, Saddam Hussein was captured. Bonds rose at 1:01 p.m. Bloomberg News said US Treasuries rise. Hussein capture may not curb terrorism. So people were moving their money from higher risk to low risk areas like US Treasuries. At, at 131, bonds fell. What did Bloomberg News say? US Treasuries fall. Hussein capture raises allure of risky assets. So the same event happened, and two completely opposing narratives were constructed to try and explain those. So this is problematic when you're trying to associate causes or effects with risk events. Decision makers tend to try and find a narrative that seems to fit the story and then move on. So you wind up with blind spots or unexplored narratives. My next type of bias, which is one that's quite well known and I already mentioned once, is the confirmation bias. Here's a really simple, somewhat silly example from Kahneman's book that demonstrates how hardwired this bias is. Whitefish eat candy. So when you read that sentence, what does your brain do? The first thing your brain tries to do is try to picture a whitefish eating a candy. You might even have thought, what does the candy look like? Is it one of those round white and red stripy ones? Or is it a long stick? Or is it maybe it's a sucker? So your brain tries to accept that as true. The scientific method, which I'm sure we all agree is responsible for most of our major advances as a species since the Middle Ages, establishes a hypothesis and then tries to disprove it. But our brain, especially system one part of our brain, is hardwired into what's called a positive test strategy. Your system one tries to prove the hypothesis. You think up an answer, or you're exposed to one, such as whitefish eating candy, and you try to prove it correct. We look for information that confirms our beliefs. In the area of social media, this drives some of the dramatic attitude polarization we seem to could see in modern politics. Will tend to interpret positive and negative information differently in the context of what we already believe. We especially we tend to remember supporting facts better and will more easily dismiss that which contradicts it, especially true if it's an emotionally charged issue. So a big part of what we do in ERM is to try to cause people to come to new conclusions, to challenge assumptions about risk sources, their potential impact on our business, and the adequacy of things we are trying to do to manage them. So obviously, confirmation bias is a huge threat. In my own experience as a consultant, when I'm starting to work with a new client that hasn't been exposed to this process before, early iterations of risk assessments with a new client will be like a virtual orgy of confirmation bias. Decision makers will automatically assume they understand their business and what they're doing to manage it is the right thing. They will tend to look for ways to confirm that they know the risks and that they're already managing them okay. And if that, of course, means that the subsequent conversation about how to improve operations is of no value. There's something closely related called choice supportive bias, and these two logos illustrate that. We tend to retroactively ascribe positive attributes to an option one is selected, like whether you're a Mac guy or a Windows guy. We're more likely to remember the reasons supporting the choice that we made. And of course, as we go through and retrieve memory and experiences, we tend to look for things that support of that thing. There's something that's very similar to that called status quo bias, a preference for the current state of affairs. The current baseline or status quo is taken as a reference point, and any change from that baseline is perceived as a loss. So similar to the confirmation bias, it reduces the provocative value of ERM during risk assessments, especially conversations about, say, priority or adequacy of actions already chosen. If people fall into the trap of just re-justifying their past decisions or the status quo, you, Mr. or Ms. whatever ERM person, will be adding zero value because there'll be no change, there'll be no learning. Let's move on to the second category, social biases about how groups interact. This photo is unfortunately less so now than maybe a decade ago, but a lot of executive teams and boards look just like the people in this picture. Decision makers' tendency is to gravitate towards and consult with people who think, look, and act like them. So every organization will have some kind of small circle of influencers with regular access to the boss. There are so many implications of this bias to ERM that it would be difficult to list them all. Of course, the value of any organization, your organization, mine, is ultimately defined by stakeholders. They may be investors, they may be creditors, customers, employees. If you can't take their diverse perspectives into account when evaluating uncertainties, impacts, and strategies, you can't really make the best decisions. You'll have less trouble reaching consensus, but the problem is your answer will be much more likely to be wrong. But also, a culture where the boss picks people who are like them is a vulnerable one. Healthy opposition needs to be part of the process of decision making. There's more than one way to look at a problem. Here's another social bias, the tendency for people to understate any dissatisfaction because they don't want to offend other people in the room. Some of what we do is in ERM is to try to deliberately introduce bad manners into the way teams interact, as in contradiction, a lack of courtesy. So there's a related issue that actually probably deserved words on this slide in hindsight, but I didn't put them there. And that's the aversion to sending or receiving bad news, sometimes called the CEO syndrome. And even worse, we tend to dislike the person who delivers bad news. And recently I read about a study where they looked at air travelers' satisfaction with gate agents at airlines. And they found shockingly that if the gate agent announced a flight delay, passengers tend to like them less. So if you are a mid-level executive in an organization and you deliver bad news to the boss, the sad news is the boss is going to like you less at the end of the experience than they did before. This is especially a challenge because, in essence, This is at the core of what we try to do as risk managers, force people to have conversations about ways we might fail. And that's just not a normal thing to do, to sit down as a group in front of the boss and talk about ways we might screw up. But that, in effect, is what builds a healthy culture. So courtesy bias and CEO syndrome are a big deal in terms of building an effective risk culture. Here's one that's similar: the tendency to follow actions or beliefs of others, not because we don't want to offend, but because as social animals, we want to be part of a group or a tribe or a team. We don't want to stick out, we want to fit in. Related to that, kind of combining those two things, is followership. If the person driving the bandwagon is also the boss. So I have a very specific um, example from my own experience. This was long ago when I was in-house risk manager at Hydro One. We had an offsite meeting attended by our chief executive at the time and the chair of our board of directors, facilitated by an external consultant, who large firm who will remain nameless. U-shaped table, facilitator in the front of the room. We were all given cards: thumbs up, thumbs down, question mark. And at regular intervals during the planning session, the facilitator would present a proposition and we would vote on them. So here's the problem. The chair of the board and the CEO were sitting sort of at the base of the U, right directly opposite the facilitator. And it was time to vote. I thought people were going to hurt their necks from looking to see how the bosses were voting before they would vote. So that is both followership, bandwagon effect, courtesy bias, all those things in one big ugly mess. So those are my social biases. Third category I said I would get into is this one: statistical mishandling. So as I said in the intro, we sometimes get exposed to a lot of data, and this can be shark-infested waters in terms of things like trend analysis, as in this picture, um, and other things that can play out in terms of handling of data. And one of those is how we handle small numbers. So there's a study, I can't remember what year it was, kidney cancer in a bunch of areas in the US, and they revealed that counties with uh, which kidney cancer was the lowest were rural, sparsely populated in this traditional Republican states in Midwest and South and to the West. Equally true, a study of 3,141 counties revealed those same counties had the highest incidence of kidney cancer. Both of these statements are true. How can this be? The reason why this can be is purely statistical. Smaller populations have broader dispersion. People have trouble understanding randomness. The reason why both these statements are true is because of the random spread involved in smaller populations. And I have a very specific example of how this led to a really expensive problematic decision. The Gates Foundation made a $1.7 billion investment following a study into what schools produce the best students on average. The result of the study was that smaller schools tend to be overrepresented in the top 100. This is based on some studies done by the US Department of Education Smaller Learning Communities program. So a whole bunch of money was invested in those smaller schools. The unfortunate fact is the obverse was also true. The worst schools also tended to be smaller than average. So smaller scale schools are just more variable. So ton of money, $1.7 billion invested because of a statistical mishandling bias involving small numbers. Here's a famous quote, right? If I praise cadets for clean execution of aerobatic maneuvers in general. Scott, you told me when we were talking about this one
Mhm.
before who the quote is, and I can't remember now, and I forgot to write it down.
Yeah, it's related to the author Daniel Kahneman, who you've already quoted and gotten a lot of this material from. This, I believe, is a quote from Amos Tversky, who was Kahneman's partner in the 60s and 70s. Unfortunately, died young before Kahneman received the Nobel Prize. And this was his way of symbolizing this problem and making it real.
So you're teaching flight cadets, and if you praise them after they do well, they do worse next time. And if you scream at them after they do poorly, they do better next time. Is that because of the intervention? No, that's because there's probably, if I do better than normal, in instance A, I'll do worse next time. And if I do worse than normal, I'll be better next time. It has nothing to do with the stimulus or the response. It has to do with the fact that things regress towards the mean. You see this all the time in things like baseball, the hot hand fallacy, all that stuff, where people will attribute externalities to what are purely just random events that generally evolve towards means. And then there's this whole problem of probability. So people tend to, first of all, there's the gambler's fallacy. If you roll heads, what is that, 6 times in a row? If I ask you what is the probability of getting tails next time, the answer is 50-50, but most people will expect the next roll to be a tails. People are massively overestimate the probability of unlikely events, and I see that all the time in my business when we'll postulate some horrible scenario, and then we'll have a discussion with the executive team, and they'll conclude there's a 50-50 chance of it surviving or not surviving, occurring or not occurring. So people tend to overestimate unlikely events and overweight unlikely events in those decisions. And there's so many examples of this. I mean, the reactions to things like terrorism. So let's put terrorism, the likelihood of death from terrorism, in the context of other things. Influenza is 500 times more likely to kill you than terrorism. Walking is 50 times more fatal than terrorism. Cycling or choking on food, 10 times more dangerous. Heat waves, 4 times more likely. So when you assess the probability of risk with a group of people, you must assume that whatever the conclusion they draw is probably wrong. For anyone who's watched my webinars in the past, this model will be very familiar. Unfortunately, cognitive bias has the potential to knock every one of these pieces out of alignment. Some kind of framework, some kind of criteria for measuring those things, some kind of enterprise-wide application to different solutions, and some kind of reporting resulting in conversations and decisions. So let's go through these one at a time. Social biases can disrupt processes in certainly conversations. So the framework and process about who and why and who participates. Of course, there you have your social biases and your tendency for people to surround themselves by people who look and operate by them. Criteria and reporting, of course, you're translating what people think in a complex conversation into a number, and people might tend to trust that number more than they probably should and report on it in simplified ways, and people will use system one to interpret those results and come to conclusions. And of course, logical biases can affect everything on this figure, but especially individual judgments on risks in context in that enterprise-wide application. So every area of ERM is threatened by cognitive bias. The end. I'm kidding. I'm going to talk about what you can do about this.
But
So
surely
first
there
of all,
must be something we can do about this.
surely there is. So what are some ways? First of all, don't rely on memory or recall. And this helps you to overcome these biases about access to information recall. One of the first steps in planning a risk assessment is to bring forward what we know, unfiltered and for easy recall. So if I'm kicking off a iteration of a risk assessment with an executive team or with an individual executive, I will catalog all the events that happened since the last iteration that are relevant to that risk. Not just those most recently called or most recent, but all of them. I will, when we're talking about probability, we will try to inject whatever we can about how often these events happen really. Use of things like mini scenarios and other examples that complicate and complete the picture, get us away of the simple answer. Let's take the simple risk of cyber attack and let's blow it out into 12 or 14 different scenarios about the way it might play. So now I can no longer just rely on my instinctive answer to the simpler question. I have to think through all these scenarios. As a facilitator, you should search for the second or third or fourth right answer to a question. The first answer is not where you stop. And one of the things that I found in some of my conversations in the interviewing people leading up to generating key risk reports when I was in-house at Hydro One is that people tended to focus on the immediate future. So that you're used to as a planner thinking about the next 6 months or a year or whatever. What I started to produce was a new product called a risk calendar. So our risk assessment is supposed to cover the next 5 years, from today till 5 years from now. So what I would provide to them is a list of known future events during that horizon, right to the end of the planning horizon, that might have an impact on the risk. So that the next election, the expiry of a collective agreement, the go live date with our new ERP, the completion date of this major project. All those different cyclical business things that we know are either going to add or subtract uncertainty to the risk and present them to them and force them to walk through them. And one of the things that I don't like much is brainstorming. Brainstorming is fun for facilitators. It's generally searingly dull for participants, but it also, unless you have a highly structured context, is just going to be a ton of, stuff that's easily accessible as opposed to an analytical process. I'll use things like frameworks and risk universes. So we will always go back to a broad view of the potential risks and target in on the key ones we're focused on and make sure we don't have any blind spots. So we force people to see and review the whole picture rather than the first thing that pops into their mind. Don't rely on memory and recall. Secondly, slow down thinking. So ways to overcome other inappropriate system one uses. Processes designed to slow down thinking, step-by-step processes we follow when evaluating risk right from first principles to ensure system two is engaged. So what are the possible futures? Then how might it affect the business and how much? Get several answers to that question. Then how does it compare to our limits? Then what do we have in place to prevent or mitigate those things? And let's get them all cataloged. And how does that compare to some kind of model of good controls? Then, given that, how likely is it the risk is to occur and have that impact? And then we make the decision, is what we're doing today adequate? As opposed to, how do you feel about this risk, right? It's a structure, it's a process, and it slows down thinking. Another one is to introduce complexity. These are difficult decisions. When you're talking about key risks to an organization, they can kill or save your organization. It can affect how well you perform relative to competitors for a long period ahead. So therefore, you need to introduce complex tools. Detailed calibrated impact criteria, which I've talked about in a previous webinar. Effective presentation of objective data. So how do you present it in a way that's going to help us give a full picture of the complexity? And a thorough model of potential treatments and controls. And in the webinar on criteria, I talked about this one, about it puzzles me how often people who are otherwise doing very effective ERM processes, when they ask decision makers about controls, they'll just do a high, medium, low thing, as opposed to presenting a model of treatments or controls like COSO or COCO or one of the other comprehensive control models and compare what we have to that. So have some kind of complex picture of what good control looks like and compare what you have relative to that. Social biases are tricky too. Common at work. It's common for workshops. Common at workshops for me to introduce people who are rarely in the room. So I will deliberately seek to invite people who I know think differently or not part of the normal executive team. When I first start working with a client, often they'll want me to use their pre-existing senior management team as the forum for risk assessments or workshops. And I might do that in the interest of helping introduce them to the process. But over time, what I want to do is get other people in the room that aren't part of that group that discuss these issues all the time as normally part of their business. And what's pure gold is someone who is, I would call, the confident, creative contrarian, someone who will effectively argue the other side with the boss. Those people within any organization, are so valuable in terms of provoking ways to overcome social biases. And then when we talk about courtesy bias and bandwagon effect, I will do things like alternate back and forth between individual and collective exercises. So this is one of the reasons why I use anonymous voting tools rather than flip cards to overcome that problem we had in that offsite. Also, interviews versus group analysis. So I will ask individuals to do some analysis before they state their views on things. I will interview people and get them thinking through things individually with just me and them in the room to get them not exposed to what other people think or what the boss thinks before we share it. Repeated exposure to the process also helps. Building muscle memory about truth to power. So this is another reason to do lots of workshops. People will know after repeated exposure to your workshop process that it's a safe place to have that unnatural conversation in front of the boss about ways we might fail. I remember being told very early in my career, over and over again, never just bring problems to the boss, also bring solutions. In what we do here in ERM, we're trying to actually break that wisdom. Bring all the problems to the boss and your peers, and let's get them on the table and let's discuss them and let's collectively make a decision. This the whole idea of just bringing problems and solutions to the boss makes the boss's job easier, but it's a truly horrible thing to do for the risk culture of your organization. And then that last point about withholding the boss's perspective. So in planning a risk workshop, I will coach the sponsor, the most senior person in the room, about how they should react to what is said, and how they react is everything. Coach the bosses. Do not speak first. Ask lots of questions and design the meetings so that it's a safe place to speak up. And there'll be a process, there'll be a step at the end where the boss makes the decision. But your role is to help me pull everybody's perspective out and onto the table so we can deal with them one at a time. In terms of statistical bias, um, limited use of probability for valuation. So I focus most of my attention in workshop design, for example, on impacts, scenarios, impacts, and controls. People like to discuss likelihood, and it's an important part of the process, but you're going to find there's less good stuff to derive from that part of the conversation than the other parts of the process. Again, because you're talking about uncertain future events. You're Any data they have is about the past and the present. So statistics really are of limited value. Wherever data is available and relevant, however, use it. Make sure it doesn't come with assumptions that the future is the same as the past or that discontinuities can't happen. But if you have good data that tells you about things like likelihood of this type of event happening to us or to others in our industry, by all means share it. And then finally, view probability in relative terms. We're we're I shouldn't say not very good. We're terrible at estimating the likelihood of future events, especially unlikely events, but we are a little bit better at estimating the relative likelihood of events relative to one another. So think about them in relative terms. Is A more likely than B, as opposed to is A 25% and B 35%? So that can help with prioritization and ranking and decision making there. You're not looking for accuracy here because, in my experience, it's hopeless. What you're trying to do is just get things in rank order. So, my key points. First of all, once again, run workshops. And I'll repeat this. I've said this. I think if I haven't, shame on me at every workshop. If you're not running workshops, you're not doing ERM. Repeat after me. If I'm not running workshops, I'm not doing ERM.
Doing ERM.
You need to run workshops. That's where you get all this stuff on the table. That's where you can inject things like scenarios and detailed criteria and facilitated processes and slow down thinking into the decision-making process in the organization until it becomes muscle memory. And then also that's provide lots of prompts like things like recent events, slow down thinking, use complex tools for complex decision, introduce diverse groups together, separate individual analysis from group discussion. When you're designing a process for risk assessment, it's like, is this a process that's better done individually without knowing what everyone else thinks, without any group bias? Or is this a process that's better done where we present all our conclusions and try to understand each other's perspectives? Make that a conscious part of how you design your tools and processes. Coach the boss to shut the heck up until they hear from everybody. And finally, be really, really careful about probability. And that really is the end. So,
Fabulous. Fabulous, Rob. I've got I almost don't know where to start. This is such a rich subject matter, and as you were talking, I was thinking of these, many instances where, not only in my own life, but talking to our customers and talking to people around this industry where this type of thing comes up. Let's start with the point that you just made, that you just reinforced with everybody about running workshops, right? As a consultant, when you walk into a company, I will bet you more often than not that they're not probably running workshops until you get there. I'm going to guess. Um, what do you commonly see in terms of how these conversations take place before they come across the wisdom of running workshops, right? Are you talked several times about get people in the room, right? And I know you might mean that metaphorically, but um Are these typically talked about in interviews with executives? Are these typically talked about in rooms with risk managers and risk owners talking? Is this typically still done behind somebody's desk and through email? What do you see commonly when you go into companies, and what kind of pitfalls are there?
So your first point about skepticism, I think you were saying about skepticism of the dive workshops. They may not have been exposed to them before. They may not fully understand. So it's a little bit like constructing a good plot for a movie
Hmm.
where everything ultimately comes up to the climax, which is whenever the criminal gets arrested or the big punchline gets said or whatever happens, even leading up a joke, right? So in the way I will do things. If I'm starting to work with you, Scott, you're say a client, I will make sure, and the end game is to come up with some kind of risk assessment that we do at a workshop. And we have some things we need to do in advance of that. So we will build a risk universe. We will assemble a risk appetite and use that to build criteria. We'll talk to individuals about their key views of risk and try and prioritize and come up with an agenda. I'll try and structure all those things so that they make people look forward to the workshop.
Okay.
So, so for example, when I talk to decision makers in an organization, either about their own individual view of risk appetite or key risks, it makes me very happy if at the end of that conversation they say, geez, I can't wait to find out what other people think the key risks are, what the risk appetite should be. So again, it's a little bit of a thing you want in the back of your head. You're trying to build excitement about the day when they all get to sit down and finally have the conversation, share their perspective. Delay that gratification, get them enthused about the idea of finding out, discovering what everybody else thinks about these different risks. So that's a big part of building uh, interest and support for workshops. And when they're over, wanting to do them again at the next iteration or apply the same process to other things. I don't know if I completely answered your question, but I think it was related.
It was a great answer to some questions, so we'll just roll with it. um, well, let me pick up on what you just said there. So, talk about the mentality around this kind of discussion, which you were just framing. And then when you talked in your session about social biases, right?
Mhm.
Everything that you talked about in that section struck me as some form of managed discomfort. It's a form of volatility, right? It's a form of healthy randomness and volatility. The idea that you are not looking for a group of people who are exactly like yourself and think in the same way. The idea
Mhm.
that you are looking for all the problems. The idea that you are really trying to you're really trying to frame a healthily uncomfortable conversation if you're doing it right, and yet something that everybody's looking forward to. Um, where I'm going with this is I think Risk already struggles with the idea of being the people that bring all the bad news to the boss, right? And perhaps unfairly getting moved into a closet sometimes as a result of that. How does risk management um, have the necessary diversity of opinion, have the necessary discomfort of bringing bad news, and manage these things without triggering people's bias to not like them, as your example with the airline attendants who announced a delay.
Well, this is reason number 4,226 for doing risk workshops because because at a risk workshop
Yeah.
you're not conveying the bad news to the boss. Everybody else is.
Hmm.
You're just providing a process. Hey, these aren't my risks. These are your risks. This isn't my perspective on the risk. This is yours. And that's way healthier. It's way healthier for a mid-level executive or decision maker, anyone, any organization, to have those kinds of conversations with their boss rather than a third party, right?
Hmm.
I mean, it's not unusual for organizations that they're struggling with ERM and don't understand why, where they do things like collect a bunch of data through surveys or through interviews and that kind of stuff, and package up a pretty report and present it to the boss. And the boss reads it and says, "Ah," and it contradicts all their preconceptions. Their system one is going, "This guy is completely wrong. I've got good control of the business. None of these things are going to happen. I hate this guy." So the way to overcome that, of course, is for you not to be the messenger. You are
Sure.
the person the savior, that we uncover these flaws and identify these scenarios before they happen, so that we're ready, or we're more ready for them. Um, I mean, before today's call, Scott, we were talking about the recent issues at Facebook and Instagram, where there was an
Mhm.
interruption back in early March for some time, and the fact that that might have done things like interrupt authentication of people trying to get into other applications. So that led us to talk about this whole thing about, well, what about other kinds of infrastructure failures and how organizations are prepared for those? And again, I mean, it's not a particularly comfortable, or as you say, courteous conversation to talk about how these kinds of scenarios and how we might cope. But I mean, le with exposure and with positioning what you do properly with the decision makers, you can demonstrate that this is in fact good news, right? That we've thought through this, we've applied this, we've done it better than our competitors have. So if the internet collapses for 2 hours, we're going to endure that scenario better than our competitors will, and we'll emerge from the end of that ahead of the game and be more successful. So it's not really about bias. It's really about, I guess it is. It's about building enthusiasm for having those kinds of uncomfortable conversations about ways we might fail.
Part of that conversation you were talking about coaching the boss, right? Holding the boss's opinion back strategically and some of those things. I'm just curious, is it often true that large personalities really interfere in a lot of these things? Have you known experiences where, because of either an intimidating nature or a big nature of the personalities of the people in charge, that no matter how you try to facilitate it or whatever, really, you can't get out of the culture, the pre-existing culture of the cult of personality there.
And the more brilliant the boss, the bigger that problem is.
I would
So so
imagine we see a lot of
so
headlines about that, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, particularly if you picture an executive who's been promoted, who's very, very smart, and they've been promoted very, very quickly because they're acknowledged as being really smart and really good problem solver, good judgment, good understanding of the business, good instincts, good ability to marshal resources and get problems done, good at managing the message and managing expectations, all those things that lead to good, successful careers. That individual will have a lot of confidence in their own judgment, and they will be used to providing context for the direct reports before a conversation. Uh, Forget about risk assessments, but in the normal course of a weekly meeting with the direct reports, they'll usually kick off the meeting by talking about, well, here's what I know is going on. Here's what the boss has told me. Here's what I've read about the competitors. What do you all think about that? But they will set the tone for the meeting. In a risk assessment,
Yeah.
you're flipping that backwards. They need to forget for a minute that they're the smartest person in the room, and they need to acknowledge that there are other people in the room that can help them be more effective by drawing what they know out of them without poisoning the well by sharing their own wisdom and keen insight and instinct in a way that's going to direct the conversation. It's funny, when I got a very big promotion in my corporate career to vice president, I suddenly found that everybody found my jokes a lot funnier.
Your jokes aren't bad, dude. So there
But
might be a
but
bit
but
some truth to it.
I went from not bad to hilarious as soon as I got promoted. Right? And I mean, I've known senior executives who really think they're that much more funny than everybody else. It's not. It's because they're the boss. You're the boss, and people are dependent. Your opinion of your reports um, will hold their career in the balance. So if I
Yeah.
have to laugh at their jokes, if I have to agree what they say about risks, if I have to assure them that our controls that are in place are all very good and nothing to worry about, boss, in order to get ahead, I'll do that. So if I don't know what you think as the boss, then I can't do those things. And so what you want to do is design the process so the other participants don't know what the boss thinks about those issues. They have to declare. Again, another reason for anonymous voting, right? You give them a complex problem. Here's a bunch of scenarios. Pick a couple of them, then go to this horribly complex set of impact criteria that might look like something like this.
Mhm.
Pick one on the scale and commit to that score. Okay, I think this could be a 4, severe because of its impact on our potential negative media coverage or our earnings in the next quarter. And I know that I'm going to have to defend that position once all the voting's in, and I'm doing that without knowing what the boss thinks. And repeated exposure to that and realizing that when you do that, it's not bad. You don't get fired. You don't get kicked out of the meeting. If the boss has been coached properly, they'll actually draw out more and give you more attention and view you as a useful resource. So it's a bit of a of a culture change in the micro sense in terms of
Mhm.
how uh, bosses and the people reports to them interact um, in a very macro level. And when you're talking about individual questions and problems.
You've just given me a horrible insecurity about whether or not certain people are laughing at my jokes. So thank you very much for that. I'm gonna have to have a chat with my group now. Um,
Right. Right.
when you're talking about uh, um, flipping this out, making this more democratic in this instance, so that these ideas percolate up from the bottom first. Is it is it still difficult to, even for groups, to apply requisite imagination to what could happen because of how interconnected things are? I remember one of our customers, I remember having a conversation with them, and they let me know that pre-pandemic, somebody had actually suggested, adding pandemics to the risk register, right? And that
Mhm,
suggestion had gotten laughed out of the room. And
mhm,
that was almost immediately before the pandemic happened. But that was in a situation that wasn't a black swan, because it was imaginable if you did
mhm.
things like, what you're saying, bring data into this, talk about how often these things happen and the increased cadence and so forth. Data's there. Um, but when you're sitting in the group trying to talk about these things, uh, um, it still requires a leap of imagination, doesn't it? Or to think about cascading effects, or to think about things that are completely divorced from what's happened recently. Is there still an issue with being able to get out enough, to exercise enough imagination, even in groups, to be able to position yourself well, like perhaps using that as an example?
Yeah, so there are a whole bunch of things you've mentioned in your question that I actually want to kind of unpack a little bit and go back
Great,
one at a
please.
time.
Yes, let's make it three questions.
First of all, use the word democratic.
Hmm.
So even though we use voting, an organization is not a democracy, right? It's a hierarchy. The whole reason for going through that whole process is to help the decision maker, this most senior person in the room, make their decision. And once that's done, that's their decision. It's not in my super early days of doing ARM in the early 2000s. And I told other folks who were also, this is all when everybody was getting started, no one had any clue how to do it. But when I mentioned that I really believed firmly in the use of anonymous voting, people would say, oh, no, you can't do that. That upsets the whole idea of an organization having hierarchical accountability and cascading accountability. So I just want
Sure.
to deal with that right away because I want to make sure everybody
Everybody
understands that when I
understands
talk
that.
about workshops
Sure.
are not about um, um, I'm not advocating for ignoring the hierarchy. There is a boss, and there's a point in the process where the boss makes the decision based on everything that was said in the room. They decide, is the risk tolerable as it is today, or do you want to change the way we treat it? And that's their decision and their decision alone. So that's the first thing you raised. The
Great.
second thing you mentioned about pandemics and the fact that pre-COVID, nobody wanted to talk about pandemics. The one thing I do want to point out is that all of a sudden pandemics is popping all over the place in
All
people's
over the
risk
place,
profile.
isn't it?
It
Yeah.
it's like the '98 ice storm, right? It's suddenly pandemics are up near the top.
Right.
That's the second one. The third one you talked about imagination. So a way I like to think about, we have the static tools we use in ERM. We have criteria that we apply for assessing risks. We have risk universes. We have a prescribed process for doing risk workshops. But there's the other side of your desk, which is about designing thought experiments. So um, I forget where we've talked about this before, whether it was a past webinar or one of the keynotes at Connect,
Hmm.
is the idea of counterfactuals.
Yeah.
So a lot of organizations today, or were recently anyway, doing lessons learned exercises about COVID and how we coped with it. So they play through all this chain of events about how things played out and how we responded and how good was that. Great, good idea, do that. Now, change the facts. If the pandemic had originated in North America rather than in Asia, if it had spread more quickly, if it had happened during a period of economic downturn or economic weakness, if, right?
Sure.
So that's how you stimulate those kinds of conversations, by asking those kinds of questions. What if COVID-19 had originated in New Jersey and not in Wuhan? What if we had just come out of the housing crisis, or we're just in the midst of the housing crisis, and we didn't have these big coffers in government pockets? How would things have played out differently, and how would our preparedness have weathered that storm? It's borrowing the concept from the classic Royal Dutch Shell scenario planning exercise, where you're not necessarily anymore trying to predict something. You're asking the thought experiment type question about, okay, if this happened, how would we cope? Okay, we've had that conversation. What did we learn from that? And how can we take those learnings and apply them to make the organization stronger, more resilient, less vulnerable than our competitors?
Fabulous. I think maybe we have time for one more question, and because of course I represent a technology company, I'm going to ask a shameless technology question right here. I'll take the opportunity. One of the points that you talked about in your solutions was the idea of not relying on memory, was the idea of lists. Charlie Munger was late Charlie Munger advocate of checklists, just like the as his training as a pilot. I've thoroughly endorsed that. What um, what's a healthy role, if any, for technology here? Like, what does a good technology enablement of ERM look like, with the idea of helping people not rely on their memories, helping enable risk managers to have something else to rely on, lists, memory jogs, automations, and so forth, in order to be able to do their job more robustly?
Well, I think one of the things that there are a whole bunch of things, reasons, of course, why technology is important to an organization. In the context of this discussion, a big one is that technology tools can help a decision maker be exposed to more people's experiences in the organization. So the consequences of events, the discoveries that happen as a result of some kind of audit or verification or compliance management
Okay.
process, the reaction of a process to an intervention, the speed with which we implement a thing. I mean,
Hmm.
that's more of just that same thing. But it's
Sure.
it's not a list anymore. It just allows me from my desk to in close to real time understand how all 5,000 employees in my company, or a subset of them anyway, are experiencing their work, and what events happen to them, and how they are managing through those things, and what they've learned from them. So that's in the context of cognitive bias anyway.
Hmm.
I think one of the reasons to enthusiastically endorse things like risk management technologies and compliance management systems and GRC tools and all that kind of stuff is it just gives you access to more people's experiences, which you can introduce to risk assessments and other decision-making processes in the organization.
Sure. That's the data that you talked about injecting in order to be able to arrive at less biased conclusions. I'm afraid we're going to
Uh,
have to. Oh, no,
okay.
no, I'm sorry. Am I
No,
wrong?
no, it's. I'm not just talking. I'm not. Big data is part of it.
Uh-huh.
Hopefully, those tools are providing more than just quantitative information. Hopefully, and this may be an application of some of the AI technology things that we've talked about in recent years,
Hmm.
to help filter more than just quantitative results, more than just performance measures, but also text
Hmm.
experiences. Yeah. So I don't think it's
Excellent.
just a matter of data to correct our problem with estimating probability. It's more foundational than that. It's about it's about not just availability, but exposure to a broad range of stuff, that might be relevant in evaluating a risk and deciding how to deal with it.
Let's see. That's a great note to leave it on. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Rob. Thank you very much. Rob, real quick, with people who want to keep up with you, other than coming to riskonnect.com and seeing your many sessions that you've done with us, your many excellent sessions, I might add, how else can people keep up with what you're doing?
I'm on LinkedIn. I'm also I'm program director of a program on enterprise risk management at Schulich School. It's a master's certificate program on enterprise risk management. So you can find that at the Schulich website. Or people are free to reach out to me directly, either through probably most easily through my LinkedIn connection, or I have a rather lousy website for my business, robertquailconsulting.com. So you can find me, get in touch with me through that as well.
I'd like to thank our guest, Rob Quail. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of you for spending some time with us today, and we will see you for the next session of Risk at Work. Take care.